Donald Trump attacks his likely opponent in the presidential election as a radical left lunatic. Kamala Harris highlights Trump's convictions and scandals, saying he offers chaos, fear and hate. So what kind of campaign will it be between the two? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, Donald Trump and his new opponent in the US presidential election, Kamala Harris, have wasted no time attacking each other on the campaign trail. Trump labeled Harris an extreme far leftist. It was his first speech since President Joe Biden dropped out. Hours earlier, Harris highlighted Trump's criminal conviction and financial scandals. She contrasted them with her record in law enforcement. American politics is rarely for the faint of heart. But this election, nevertheless, already looks like it's shaping up for new levels of hostility. So what do these early exchanges tell us about the campaign to come? We'll be discussing this with our guests shortly. But first, this report from Veronica Pedrosa.
Republican candidate Donald Trump has used his first campaign speech since Joe Biden dropped out of the election to attack his new opponent.
If Kamala Harris gets in, she would be the most radical far-left extremist ever to occupy the White House times 10. There's never been a lunatic like this in the White House, and we've had some bad ones.
He went on to blame Kamala Harris for what he says is one of the Biden administration's failures: security along the US-Mexico border.
She supports decriminalizing illegal border crossings, and she supports mass amnesty for all illegals. Think of that.
For her part, the vice president has mapped out what her campaign calls the path to victory, drawing on her background as a lawyer. A former California Attorney General, she's been quick to describe Trump as a convicted felon.
I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators who abused women. Fraudsters who ripped off consumers. Cheaters who broke the rules for their own gain. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
If elected, Harris would be the first woman to serve as US president. Abortion rights are expected to be a major issue in her campaign. It's one area where she has an advantage over Trump among women voters.
Well, let me tell you something. When I am president of the United States, and when Congress passes a law to restore those freedoms, I will sign it into law.
President Biden has called his endorsement of Harris the best decision he's ever made. And Democrats need voters to feel the same way if Harris is to succeed him. Veronica Pedrosa, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Well, let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Washington, D.C., Eric Ham, a political analyst and co-author of The GOP Civil War, Inside the Battle for the Soul of the Republican Party. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, Thomas Gift, director of the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London. His research focuses on comparative politics and the political economy. And also in Washington, D.C., Jennifer Victor, an associate professor of political science at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. A warm welcome to you all. If I could start with Jennifer. So, Jennifer, looking at the latest speeches by both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, does it look like this campaign is now going to be even more personal, even more vicious?
Well, I think the expectation, even before the change in candidacy, was that this would be a pretty vicious campaign, to use your words. The electorate is closely divided. By all accounts, it seems like this will very likely be a close election. I judge that just based on the polling. And so whenever you have a political situation where you have tight races, where each side believes that there is sort of some very dramatic negative consequence from losing, it really tends to amp up the rhetoric and
but Jennifer, there were these
nastiness.
hopes, at least after that assassination attempt on Donald Trump, that maybe the rhetoric might calm down. Does it look like those hopes are gone? This is going to be a bare knuckles fight with no holds barred.
Yeah, so the best predictor for future behavior is past behavior. And we have a lot of evidence from Donald Trump about how he treats his political opponents. He tends to treat his political opponents with a very insulting kind of delegitimizing kind of air. And while he did gain quite a bit of sympathy after the assassination attempt, and we did see, to some extent, a little bit of a softening of the rhetoric for a brief moment at the RNC from him, it does not look like that's going to stick, and I'm not sure that we should expect it to.
Eric, looking again at the latest campaign speeches, does it look like the Trump strategy here going forward is to try and portray Kamala Harris as a radical leftist, as someone with a very extreme position on abortion? He called her a president, or the Republicans are portraying her as a president for criminals and illegal aliens.
Yeah, I think that's part of the playbook that we're going to see from the Republicans moving forward. And also, too, I think while there has been already some approach by Republicans to denigrate her based on race and gender, I think where they might be able to actually gain ground is actually focusing on her policies. I think continuing to go after her based on identity politics might not work, especially given such a tight race that we're in. And of course, this could be decided on the margins, and the focus should be on trying to win back some of those independents and suburban women. And I think going after identity politics is not going to do much to help with either of those key constituencies. Thomas,
On the other hand, looking at Kamala Harris's latest speeches, does it look like her strategy is simply one of portraying this as a choice between former prosecutor and the felon, going after Trump as a convicted felon who's a threat to America, and she's the one who can save the country because she used to be a prosecutor?
Well, to a large extent, I think that that's correct. And I think for Harris, her strategy is largely to keep the limelight on Donald Trump. She really wants this election to be a referendum on his 4 years where he was in office, where there was chaos, where there was multiple impeachments, where there was so many scandals and mini scandals in between. I think her message to voters is, do you really want to return to that lack of normalcy? Haven't the last 4 years actually been a relief from such vitriol? And so to the extent that she can paint Donald Trump as a convicted felon and link that into broader conversations about his challenges to democratic institutions and norms, she's on surer footing.
Eric, looking at where things stand now, and I know it's still early on in the campaign between these two in particular, Trump and Kamala Harris as a presumptive presidential nominee, whose arguments do you think, when you look in your crystal ball, whose arguments do you think is going to win over, or look like it's going to win over, the swing voters and those independents?
Well, it's unsure to predict exactly what's going to happen day to day. But what we're seeing is, since that debate debacle by Joe Biden, Donald Trump has no longer been the star of this political campaign show. It's been all about the Democrats, specifically about Joe Biden. Would he stay in? Would he exit the race? Now that he is out, now that Kamala Harris has ascended to the top of the ticket, so much of the oxygen, so much of the energy is now focused around Democrats and Kamala Harris. And quite frankly, what the Trump campaign needs to do right now is actually try to find a way to actually get more of the attention back on them, back on their agenda. What they would have preferred to do is actually try to paint a narrative of Kamala Harris in a way that would have been negative, very similar to what Barack Obama did to Mitt Romney back in 2012. But because so much of the attention is on Kamala Harris right now, I don't think that's going to happen. And so it looks like there's going to be a climb for the Republican in this race right now, because it doesn't appear they got much of a bump out of the assassination attempt or even out of the convention. And now all eyes are not only on Kamala Harris, but who her VP pick will be, and of course, what happens in Chicago next month.
So the spotlight on the Democratic camp, a bit of a retune going on, Jennifer, would you say, actually, for both Democrats and Republicans because of Biden's decision to pull out?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've not been in this situation before, and watching the Democratic Party change the candidate at the top of their ticket and almost immediately coalescing around that new candidate has been quite a phenomenon. I mean, if you were scripting it in advance, I'm not sure you could have scripted some sort of smoother, more sort of successful kind of transition from one to the other. And the Democratic coalition has been coming together with sort of an impressive veracity. The Republicans, on the other hand, I'm a little surprised that seem to be caught a bit flat-footed. They didn't seem to be prepared for this potential shift, even though there was quite a bit of speculation about it. And they haven't quite honed in on exactly what their messaging is going to be against Kamala Harris. And so I think we're just going to have to give them a little bit of time to find their footing. In the meantime, while they're doing that, I agree with Eric that the Democrats have the spotlight on them, and this is not the favored position for Donald Trump or the Republicans. The Democrats have an advantage, though, because they haven't had their convention yet, and there's a lot of attention right now on who might be the vice presidential running mate for Kamala Harris. And so I expect the campaign to sort of draw that speculation out so that they can keep the attention on them right up until their convention in a similar way that the Republicans did.
They're also trying to shift some attention when they're not attacking each other on a personal level, Thomas. An attempt by the Democrats on the one hand to try and tie Trump to Project 2025, that conservative policy blueprint. We should point out, of course, it is not an official Republican Party document. But is that part of the approach to try and tie that document, what is seen as very extreme policies, with Donald Trump and say, this is a threat to democracy?
Well, I think absolutely. So Project 2025 is a document that in large part was written by former Trump associates and aides. It's affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, which is a right-wing think tank. I do think to an extent, Democrats are going to have success with that message by painting Trump as kind of radically right-wing and outside of the mainstream. At the same time, the Trump administration has pushed back at that.
Can they get enough success to win over undecided voters? Do you think that Kamala Harris can pull it off?
Well, that's ultimately going to depend on how some of these issues resonate with swing voters in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin. I still think, based on the polling, that Trump maybe has a marginal advantage. But I do think that Kamala Harris's poll numbers aren't necessarily fixed. Americans are just now starting to get to know her. She has an opportunity to kind of offer a second first impression, so to speak, and define her candidacy. I agree that choosing a vice president is going to be very important in kind of directing what that trajectory will be going forward, whether she chooses someone more on the progressive left who can galvanize the base, or a centrist, probably governor like Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, to really lock in those more moderate centrist voters.
Hold that thought, Thomas. You've raised two really important points which we do want to talk about, what the latest polls might indicate and who a running mate might be for Kamala Harris. But before we go there, I want to ask Eric, looking as well at how the Republicans have tried to focus on issues, does it look so far, they're not so far focused so much on the policy issue history of Kamala Harris as much as they are focused on trying to tie Kamala Harris to some of the policy issues which were seen as weak points for Joe Biden? We're talking about, inflation, borders, immigration.
Yeah, that's right. But I think what we're seeing here is just a Republican Party that simply hasn't found its footing on how to actually combat this new candidate. This is a party that is now struggling, and now they're just throwing a lot of things at the wall to see what sticks. But I do believe their issue, Republicans have primarily focused on the issue of the border and immigration. And so I think that is an area where they could have some traction. We know that when the Biden-Harris administration came into office, one of the first tasks that was given to Kamala Harris was that of the border. And so I do believe there could be room for a more robust policy discussion. But of course, we know that simply isn't in Donald Trump's bailiwick. That is not how he likes to campaign or go after his opponents. He does so, I think, in a more personal way. And so I don't think you're going to see Donald Trump as a candidate lead with policy differences or contrast, it's going to be more personal with policy issues more in the backdrop or as a secondary measure to use as a cudgel against his opponents.
That's an interesting point. Briefly, Thomas, does that explain and will it help Kamala Harris to have Democratic heavyweights like former President Barack Obama appear on the campaign trail with her as a way of countering some of what Eric was saying we might expect from the Republican Party, of the sort of personal attacks on her as a crazy lunatic leftist? Say no, actually, she rubs shoulders with the mainstream heavyweights of the Democratic camp.
Well, Kamala Harris, whenever she was in the Senate, did have a voting record that was among the most liberal in that chamber. So I do think that she's going to get pushed back by Republicans on the accusation that she is outside the mainstream, that she's pushing a progressive agenda. So I do think that it's important to have kind of some moderates out on the campaign trail touting her as a candidate. We've seen the Clintons come out for Kamala Harris. I think Barack Obama is just a matter of time. Of course, Joe Biden endorsed her. So that's going to be important because most of the attacks from Republicans are going to be about the fact that she's a Trojan horse for the far left, very similar to what was done in 2020 against Joe Biden.
Jennifer, let's talk a little bit about the indications, if we can call it that, about where independent voters might be. The fact that the Democrats have raised, I think it's like $126 million since Sunday. And the more important fact maybe that 64% of it coming from first-time donors. Is that indicative that Harris is reaching new donors, new voters, young voters, some of the swing voters, or are we reading too much into the number?
Well, I think mostly what we're seeing is an incredible sort of surge of excitement around her candidacy. But those, both the total number in terms of the, over $100 million being raised in such a short period of time, that's just, we haven't seen that before. That's really unheard of. And that a majority of that money was donated by people who hadn't donated previously, really suggests that the Democrats may have done the right thing here by changing the candidate at the top of their ticket, because now they have a candidate that people can really get excited about and get behind.
Jennifer, do we know who those first-time donors are? Are they the young, the old? Are they, independents? Do we have any sort of data about them?
No. When people make those contributions, they're only required to disclose sort of where they are and their occupation. And so we don't have specific demographic data on those donors. We could maybe in the future do some surveys to try to assess that out. And I'm sure, it's very early days. It's only been a few days since she sort of stepped into this spotlight. And we're going to be looking at polls. We're going to be looking at various types of endorsements from interest groups. And continue to look at those campaign finance numbers to see if she can sustain that kind of excitement further. At the moment, if you combine the candidate war chest with the outside money that both the Republicans and Democrats have for Trump and Harris at this point, it's close to similar. Donald Trump's total's around $450 or so million, and Harris is around $4.25 maybe. Harris has more in contributions to her campaign, whereas Trump has more outside support, which has been typical of the last number of cycles between Republicans and Democrats. And so what I'm going to be looking for is whether those trends stay the same over the coming weeks as things kind of settle in here.
All right, Jennifer mentioned the polls here, so it's probably a good time to start talking about them. Love them, hate them, leave them, but they do play a role, Eric, don't they? Let me pull out one of the latest ones, the SSRS poll published Wednesday. It shows Kamala Harris gaining more support from young voters, women, Black and Hispanic voters. How much faith do you rely on the polls at this stage? It's, as Jennifer said, it's only been just a few days since she entered the race.
Well, I don't think we should put too much stock in the polls, even though on some level they are indicative of where the race stands, at least in that moment. However, what we know is going all the way back to 2022, many of the polls simply they actually undervalued Democrats in many of these races, which is why in a lot of special elections, Democrats have actually been so successful. And also, I think what we're seeing in these polls that I think do have some resonance is that Donald Trump, even if you go back to 2016 and 2020, his ceiling has always been in the low 40s. Right now, it's looking like it's about 46%. And so I think what we're seeing here is, once again, Donald Trump has had a ceiling. And I think that ceiling simply isn't enough to get him over that 50% threshold, which is where I think he's going to find trouble. I think with Kamala Harris, I think the verdict is still out on what her final numbers look like. But what we do know is that she does have room to grow. And we're seeing a lot of that growth already, particularly with change among young people, African Americans, and of course, women as well. So I think what this means is, while the polls might, I think, be all over the place right now, I think some things that do remain the same is Donald Trump has a ceiling issue that he's going to have to address. Kamala Harris, of course, we know is trying to break one of the oldest glass ceilings in American politics. And the question is going to be, which one of these candidates is going to break out of that ceiling? Whoever can do so certainly will win.
You know, talking about the polls being all over the place, that's exactly the kind of picture I think we're seeing, aren't we, Thomas? Let me quote you another poll, a Reuters Ipsos poll completed on Tuesday, that one was. Well, it showed Harris actually leading Donald Trump by 2 percentage points, whereas the SSRS poll, which I mentioned earlier, well, that shows the opposite, Trump leading Harris by 3 percentage points. Now, the picture obviously not entirely clear. They're both in the margin of error. But is it, in a sense, slightly better news for Kamala Harris compared to the sort of polls we've been hearing for Biden before, which were mostly or quite frequently putting him behind Donald Trump?
Well, a few points here. One is that these national polls can be somewhat concealing of what the numbers look like in key swing states. And ultimately, it's in key swing states where this election is going to be decided. The second point is that Kamala Harris is still very much in her honeymoon period right now. She just announced, or she just became the nominee. There's a lot of excitement, a lot of enthusiasm. I think there's sort of pent-up demand within the Democratic Party about having a change at the top of the ticket. Now they have the change at the top of the ticket. And so, of course, much of the media and the press is focused on the fact that she would be sort of the first woman to hold the White House, that she would be the first woman of color to gain that position. I think whenever you look at the polls now, though, it's just too early to tell. I think that Harris does have an opportunity to grow in those numbers, but she also has an opportunity to decline, which is why I think ultimately Americans are just now getting a serious look at her and trying to make the decision about whether to support her candidacy.
Jennifer, let's talk a little bit about one issue that we saw and has been credited with Biden's withdrawal from the race, debating skills. Do you think the oratory performance that we should expect from Kamala Harris is going to be on a different level, given her background as a prosecutor?
Oh, absolutely. She's a skilled debater. She's a skilled presenter. She's a skilled speaker. She has a robust personality that I think comes through well on camera. And she is used to being in sort of confrontational situations because of her experience as a prosecutor. So this is definitely going to be more of an asset for the Democrats going forward, particularly relative to Biden, who got a lot of sort of sympathy for overcoming some of his challenges in that area in his life in a way that I think was very endearing to a lot of Americans. That make him very relatable. But as sort of on the metrics of public speaking skills, there's no question that Kamala Harris has some real advantages there relative to Biden.
All right. Also, Eric, a question here about who the running mate for Kamala Harris might be. There's been much discussion, much research over the years about the question of whether Sarah Palin cost John McCain some of those independent voters in the 2008 contest. How key is the running mate here for Kamala Harris?
I think when we think about running mates, I think it's sort of a thankless task because while running mates certainly don't, I think, propel you to victory, I guess depending on who you pick, they can be damaging to the campaign ultimately, like many might suggest with Sarah Palin. And I think that's perhaps what's happening also with J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. J.D. Vance just didn't bring anything to the table. He's a political lightweight, having only served in the Senate for less than 2 years. And now so much of his record, particularly around women, is becoming an issue for him. I think where this could actually bolster Kamala Harris is that her selection will say a lot about how she actually manages different roles in the assignment of being commander in chief. I think when Sarah Palin was selected, there were those who perhaps questioned John McCain's question his ability in terms of picking someone like her. Whereas I think in this instance, I think there are so many potential really great candidates at Kamala Harris's disposal that could actually bring her advantages in key states. I think she's got a really boon here in terms of what she can do in terms of this pick.
Eric, it sounds like you're saying as long as you don't really mess it up in picking your vice presidential running mate, it shouldn't really be too much of an issue. Am I paraphrasing you correctly?
Well, that's right. But I think also, too, I think she's got some real opportunities here. Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Mark Kelly of Arizona, Roy Cooper of North Carolina. These are people who I think could actually be very well in delivering the state and also will add 2 to 3 points, I think, to the overall outcome of this race. And so I think she's got a lot of choices at her disposal.
All right. I think we've got 60 seconds. Thomas, a final thought. It's been said this is the honeymoon period. What does the marriage look like then when the honeymoon's over, if during the honeymoon we're already slinging mud at each other's characters?
Well, I would certainly agree that this is going to be a vicious campaign. This is the way that Trump has always campaigned. It's because his base is galvanized by it, and I don't think that we should expect anything different. The fact that there were some speculations about, maybe Trump turning over a new leaf after the assassination attempt. I think we saw at the Republican National Convention that that's not going to be the case. And so there's going to be a lot of mudslinging between both of these candidates.
So keep your wet-proof suits on as we follow this campaign, I think is the advice there. Let's thank our guests. It's been a great show. Thomas Gift, Eric Ham, and Jennifer Victor. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.